well, once this shelter becomes the more fully transitional shelter that it wants to be, you know, it'd be nice sometime in the next 5 years or so to be able to take that temporary emergency night shelter and evolve that into another shelter that would go through another process of siting. I can imagine other shelters that might be envisioned.
Support guidelines, of course, but I'd like to know about standards. You know, without getting into the semantics, perhaps, you know, I'd like to look at other communities' standards. Maybe we don't pick certain standards right now, but I want to know about other community standards. And to me, that's gathering all of the information that I would need in order to make a decision. And I'm worried a little bit about just guidelines in that, you know, we have the NCD process and the guidelines from that, but, you know, we're having to revisit the NCD in a couple of cases, and those guidelines aren't strong enough, apparently, for instance, in a couple of neighborhoods, and we're having to revisit those. So, and also I asked the question, as you know, they look at guidelines, aren't they also looking at standards to develop guidelines? And so I just want as much information that I can have.
Whether they are guidelines or standards that you put into an ordinance, I think the question that at the time you have a special use permit in front of you, if that time ever comes and there's a hearing, you'll be looking at an application for a special use permit for a shelter, perhaps at this particular location that's been identified, and the question you'll have is, what should we consider in determining whether this should receive a special use permit? And do we have certain standards we apply to this site? Do we have guidelines? Whatever they are, guidelines or standards, you're going to be looking at the specific application and saying, does this meet the findings of a special use permit as supplemented by whatever guidelines or standards we're also considering that you adopted or the planning board has recommended. So, I mean, I think you can talk about those types of issues. That, you know, what are the concerns we have for a shelter operation wherever it's going to be sited, and develop those with the help of the planning board now and have those in place, and then when an application comes before you for public hearing for a special use permit for a particular site, you will have those. And so I think you can talk about the idea of what you're looking at, guidelines, standards now. You have in the back of your mind that, yes, there's a pending application, but you're not talking about that application now.
We need to try really hard to think about if we're going to move forward directing the planning board to do these guidelines, that we have something that's going to be useful. Because it's also not true that it will necessarily be 10 years. In the last 10 years, we've had the siting of the women's transitional space, we've had, and Freedom House, and this project, which all presumably would fall under these, you know, it's the closing of the community house and the opening of this men's transitional facility that's bringing this up to us. But we would have had application for such guidelines over the last 10 years on multiple occasions, not just this one. So I would assume we would have others as well in the future, and not necessarily 10 or 15 years from now.